And so when we look at Project Mockingbird, we really have to go all the way back to World War II, beginning with Operation Paperclip, which there's a really fantastic book written by Annie Jacobsen on Operation Paperclip.
The story is told in the new book, Operation Paperclip. Author and journalist Annie Jacobsen joins us now. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
So these were top scientists in the German war effort, sought out by the U.S. military as the war was coming to an end.
That's right. These were Hitler's top weapons makers, and Operation Paperclip became a classified military program to bring them to the United States. It also had a public face, so there was, on the one hand, the truth about the program kept secret, and on the other hand, the idea that we'll tell the public that these are the good Germans.
And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that this was only made public knowledge through FOIA in the 1980s or maybe early 90s by a journalist who was writing a story on this. And everyone said, this is a conspiracy, this is crazy, of course this isn't true. But of course it turned out through FOIA that it was true, that America essentially hired, I believe it was 1,400 Nazi scientists who were all basically guilty of horrible war crimes in Nazi Germany, doing all kinds of these mind control experiments on the Jews. People like Werner von Braun, who we know was the head of NASA at that point. We elected to be the head of NASA. And Dr. Walter Schreiber, who was the Surgeon General of the Third Reich of Hitler's Nazi Germany. I mean, these are like, Hitler's firsthand men in his ranks that we basically hired and said, oh, these are the good Nazis. If there is such a thing, we got the good ones. Don't worry. They're very good people, and they're going to help us with our science. And so obviously now we know that there's a huge moral question behind that, right? Walter Schreiber was the head of the vaccine program for the Jews, which was the way they were testing a lot of their vaccines and testing a lot of their basically ways of putting people to sleep permanently. And we brought him over to be the head of America's vaccine program. And so when you look back at history now with this understanding, it tends to skew the way you see not only our country, but the world in general. And you have to really rethink and research, what really happened behind the scenes of World War II, what was really the purpose, the intention behind a lot of these things that were going on. So I'll just pitch the first question to you, Addie. When it comes to World War II, how did World War II lead into Operation Paperclip and eventually MKUltra?
Yeah, it's a good question. And similar to what we were discussing earlier with Justin, they often use some sort of distraction and as a ways to control attention while they complete the covert operations. But the precursor to the CIA during the war was the Office of Strategic Services, because the government and military realized that they were far overstretched in terms of intelligence, and there was just so much going on during the war in all theaters, and even in a place like Yugoslavia, it wasn't as simple as fascists and then those fighting the fascists. There was loyalists to the monarchy at the time. There was the communists, of course, the collaborators with the fascists. So even in a country like that, you have more than two armed groups, basically. And this was going on all over the world. So the OSS was created and transitioned in the post-war years to the Central Intelligence Agency. But as far as the end of the war goes, you had tons of German and Japanese scientists as well, a lot of intellectual horsepower that the United States was not just going to let escape to Russia, which that was usually the two choices they had, was either defect to the Soviets or the United States. And oftentimes it wasn't a choice. It was really a matter of who captured the scientists and who captured those individuals. For example, Reinhard Gehlen is a spy master that was working with the United States before the war was even over. And I actually make that point out in my book because the idea that intelligence agencies are sovereign is probably a false one to begin with because of that. Even looking at today with how the CIA helped the Germans with their new federal intelligence agency, which is called the BDN. But because of that, Paperclip was enacted to make use of all these scientists, all the intellectual horsepower, like I mentioned, Werner von Braun, you mentioned NASA, and I actually went to the Kennedy Space Center earlier this year, and they have his name on one of the exhibits. So they're getting a little less hidden about it, or a little bit more forthcoming with the fact that this stuff did go on. And I found that interesting. But again, Paperclip was towards the end of the war, and really was running the Nazis instead of running guns or other things to first Argentina, principally, and Justin can expand on this as well, and then the United States. Klaus Barbie, for example, who was basically a torture specialist for the Nazis in Lyon, France, he started working with our intelligence as well, spying on the communists in kind of post-war Europe, and he was protected years later. And again, he fled to South America, and the French eventually did capture him, but he was like 90 years old or something. And he was pretty much dead by that point. I think they only had him in custody for like 3 or 4 years, I want to say. But yeah, the main goal with the Paperclip, Operation Paperclip, was really capturing all that intellectual power, horsepower, like I mentioned, from not just the Germans, but the Japanese and really any other operators that the U.S. government could make use of, because that was the main objective, along with preventing them from going under Soviet control, because the Cold War and the nuclear arms race really was already in full swing in many ways by the middle of the century.
Yeah, I think we've seen throughout history the way that the government always wants to cover its tracks, so we don't find out the things that they're really doing behind the scenes with the FBI and the CIA, because that's going to build distrust amongst the population, which is always what precurses a revolution. And an interesting fact about the journalist, her name was Linda Hunt, who broke the story of Operation Paperclip in the 90s through FOIA, was that the government, after they have to oblige her request for the information, but they sent her a bill for $125,000, which they called the Xerox fees, to print off the documents for her, which is sort of the government's, backhanded way of being like, we know what you're doing, we know you're trying to expose us, and don't mess with us. Like, we have the power to ruin you if we want to. So we see how sensitive this information was, because when you find out the things that these war criminals that we hired were doing to the Jews, it's just beyond nauseating to think about. The experiments of, they were trying to figure out all kinds of things for their own science, like at what temperature does a body freeze to death? How much G-force can a body withstand before, imploding on itself, and all the vaccination stuff, and just horrible anti-human type experiments that, we said on the mainstream news back then, oh, we want to go save the Jews, that's why we're getting into this war. But then, of course, we hired the people to work for us who tortured them for all those years, and because we wanted the knowledge that they had gained through those war crimes and experiments. So are you familiar, either Justin or you, Addie, with some of the things that the Nazis were doing to the Jews in their experiments in Nazi Germany, and how that became the experiments that we started running in MKUltra with the CIA?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very big subject, because during that time, during World War II, a lot of the experiments, mind control experiments, were being run even before the Jews were imprisoned in the camps. It's just the escalation of the experiments and the scope of the experiments began to go up drastically, and the stakes were much higher. I think, especially when you start talking about MKUltra, because MKUltra was really what they call a black box program. It was, a lot of the paperwork, I think, has probably been destroyed for us, or is hidden somewhere where we can't find it. So the stuff we have found out about MKUltra, it's really just scratching the surface. And we also know that from survivor testimony of people who've been involved in the project to this day. During that time, a lot of it was about seeing how much you can manipulate the mind and the consciousness of somebody. So, for instance, one of the things that they can do to us now, which probably a lot of people would hesitate to believe, but they can implant thoughts. within our subconscious. They can actually create dreams for us to dream. All that was being done and experimented on during that time. So as MKUltra began to become formed, they wanted to start to escalate what the Nazis had done. So, American military budget, secret budgets, they were running programs out of New York and San Francisco where they were experimenting on people. For instance, a lot of people, there was a honey trap operation where they would get men to come back to these hotel rooms, and then they would drug them with LSD and then just see what they did, for instance. So they say, well, why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because they created LSD. So they wanted to see what kind of effect this was going to have on a soldier or on a foreign adversary. There's all kinds of scope for these kind of experiments.